today has given lectures all over the world about evolutionary topics. Dr. Andrew Berry is assistant head tutor, integrative biology, and lecturer on organismic and evolutionary biology at Harvard. His research combined the techniques of field biology with those of molecular biology to seek evidence at the DNA level of Darwinian natural selection. His title is Coincidence, Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, and what their discovery of the theory of evolution by natural selection can tell us about how science works. We welcome you again to join us after the talk. And now, Andrew Berry.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, too, for the invitation. Yes, organismic and evolutionary biology. I'll tell this story often, but it's worth retelling. In the old days, Harvard had a biology department that was very sensible, studied life. Right? Biology departments historically have not got on internally, so it bifurcated into a sort of molecular end and the not molecular end. What should we call the not molecular end? At the time, we had a German head of department, a particular kind of person, Germans, that like to make new words unnecessarily by concatenating syllables together. So it was he who came up with the word organismic. Completely unnecessary, because there's a perfectly good word, organismal. Right? I don't know what, well, he didn't invent it, so he wasn't interested in it. Anyway, this is all well and good, fine, we're organismic. Except because it doesn't exist, it auto-corrects in Microsoft Word and elsewhere to orgasmic. I was just telling Stuart actually several years ago, in the good old days we had a hard copy course catalogue. There it was, banner headline, offerings in the Department of Orgasmic and Evolutionary Biology. Now any normal university, this is the sad part of the story, any normal university, people would be hammering the door down to get academic credit for orgasms. Right? Not at Harvard. Oh, no, I don't want to do that. It's too frivolous. I won't get into medical school if I date those courses. I just think that's tragic. Yes, it's very nice to be here on Darwin Day. Actually, Darwin Day. I gave another Darwin Day talk on Wednesday, which is, Darwin Day -4. It's sort of spreading the love, rather. I suppose it's like celebrating Valentine's Day on the weekend beforehand or whatever. Anyway, so it is a real pleasure and a privilege to be here. I was invited. Where's Simon gone? He's left. No, he's not. He's lurking over there. On his phone. Simon, nice to see you. Simon invited me to go to MIT. I hope you weren't there, because there's only so much you can say every Darwin Day, and I suspect there's quite a lot of overlap. But anyway, Simon is here to test that particular hypothesis. I'm going to be, talking about what we talk about when we talk about Darwin. I'm also especially going to be talking about the other Darwin, the oft overlooked, the typically neglected figure in this story, namely Alfred Russel Wallace, who, remember, was the co-discoverer of the theory of evolution by natural selection, not just some sort of also-ran, except now he's perceived as an also-ran. I mean, nobody's even heard of him. If I walk into a classroom full of first years here and say, who's heard of Charles Darwin? Not a hand remains unraised, except for the very shy student who never raises their hand. But if I mention that, then I say, what about Alfred Russel Wallace? There's the 3 kids who feel it's necessary to put their hands up even if they don't know, just to look good. Wallace has become truly obscure, which is remarkable when you consider that in 1858, on the 1st of July, this theory, which, and I love the quotation from Dan Dennett, is no question, it's the best idea, not just in biology, it's the best idea anyone's ever had. It's super simple, it explains so much. That idea was unveiled on the 1st of July, 1858, in a weird joint paper. Now, a joint paper typically is me and one of my students work hard jointly on a collaborative project. I have the ideas, I'm the PI, student does all the work. but then we publish, and it's genuinely collaborative. This was a co-publication, Darwin and Wallace, which was not a co-publication in that it wasn't in any way collaborative. In fact, they exchanged about 3 letters in total. There was no collaboration there at all. What it was, weirdly, was not a joint paper. It was the double publication of 2 separate statements by two separate people of the same idea. So it's sort of one of the weirdest scientific papers in the history of scientific papers. One. Don't want to bore the people in the lobby. It's one of the weirdest papers in history. It's absolutely the most important. But why then have we lost sight of poor old Alfred Russel Wallace? What's happened to him? I'll talk about this at the very end. You Google evolution, you get Mr. Lugubrious, the big forehead, the big beard, weighed down by all the responsibility, Charles Robert bloody Darwin.
Thank you.
You don't get any Wallace action. So, 2 caveats. One, I'm a Wallace aficionado. I love Wallace. And part of my goal is to convert you into Wallace aficionados. And I will succeed. Because the Wallace story is so fantastically engaging. You're going to regret that we even celebrate Darwin. We should celebrate. We should celebrate. And this is my second point on this. The 8th of January. Because it was on the 8th of January, 1823, that Alfred Russel Wallace was born. So Alfred Russel Wallace is 200 this year. So that's the other reason that not only am I fixated on Wallace, but I actually have a sort of hook to hang my Wallace hat on this year because he's 200 years old. He's dead actually, but so this is what I'm going to talk about. And this is so just emblematic. Wallace spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, very interested in birds of paradise. This is a bird of paradise which he discovered and which was subsequently named in his honour, standard wing of bird of paradise. So again, you get the message, Wallace is kind of cool, sexy. Darwin? Yeah, we all know about the bloody finches. Snack, 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 snack. But the most important thing here is, yes, this idea, and that's what's brought us all together. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, I don't want to sound like a less bearded version of Dan Dennett, but he's so right. This exquisitely simple idea, I can teach it to a 7-year-old, evolution by natural selection, is immensely powerful. It explains biological diversity. I mean, just some of nature's products are ridiculous. And you have to remember, it all started about 3.9 billion years ago, when we had some wriggling little RNA molecule, or whatever we deem the first dawn of life. And it's obviously a semantic issue. Is that alive? Is that right? When does chemistry become biology? But about 3.9 billion years ago, and you've had this splitting process to produce that family tree, the tree of life. And I don't know what the current is. People have weird arguments about how many species there are alive on Earth today, maybe 15 million. And they're amazing. And it's this simple genealogical split, tree split, split process that has produced that. Biological diversity, we explain biological diversity, handy. 2, we explain design, which is that biological diversity isn't just sort of groovy, stupid, colourful things, but useful, adapted, remarkable things. And I've got the hummingbird there. What a metabolism. What an extraordinary way of life. And what a perfect bill. Just the right length, just the right structure to probe to the base of that flower to harvest that nectar. So those are 2 biggies, I think we'll agree. But the whoops, what's that? Ooh. Maybe I'm going to kill this recording thing. I think maybe we should just play this back as usual. Good. Yeah. We lost Shakespeare. No, and look, again, this is the Dan Dennett statement.
There is no idea more seismic in the history of ideas than the notion that us, vaunted, brilliant, brainy, domineering in terms of planetary dominance, wonderful, smart, us, are nothing more and nothing less than modified great apes. And this remarkable organ, which is responsible for all our great achievements, is nothing more than a modified great ape brain. That's a stunning realization, actually. And I'm sorry, yes, again, with Dan Dennett, I mean, forget Copernicus. Who cares whether we're going round that or it's going round us? Right? This is as big as it gets. So this idea is central to all of thought, all of experience. And what's more, it's one that we've been seeking for a long time. So more or less, from the moment that humans started thinking hard about things, and I don't know exactly when that was, we've sought answers to these questions. Where do we come from? Yeah, I mean, come from mum and dad, and from grandpa and grandma, and so on, but if we keep going back, where does it all begin? What's our connection? We go out and look outside, and there are all sorts of monkeys and weird fish and stuff. What's our connection with them? And what's more, what's our connection if we're going to assume there was a big G designer up there who did all this? What's our connection with the big G designer? Okay? Everyone thinks about these things, not just humanists. And that's the reason why every society, and this truly is a universal, a human universal, has some set of stories, some sort of explanations to explain the answers to these questions, where we come from, what our connection to the rest of the natural world is, and so on. And obviously these are typically creation myths. So everyone's thinking hard about this. It's a super simple idea. When I say super simple, I mean it. I love this quotation from Thomas Henry Huxley. Thomas Henry Huxley, as you probably know, is famously billed as Darwin's bulldog. And he was, if you were having dinner with Darwin, Darwin would be picking the carrots out of his beard and sort of being slightly mumbly and not very coherent. It would be Huxley, who's rapier sharp. He's the one who's making super smart comments. He's the one who's taking down the critic and so on and so forth. He's the bright one. He reads The Origin of Species and he has a sort of Homer Simpson moment. I love this. It's so bloody obvious. How extremely stupid not to have thought of that. So what we've got is a very long, sought-after idea. Everyone's thinking about these things, wants to know the answers. We've got a very simple answer, frankly, and yet we have to wait until 1859 for it to be unveiled. And what's more, and this is the interesting thing, it wasn't unveiled once. This is my point with the Darwin-Wallace story. It wasn't discovered once by Charles Darwin in some magical eureka moment in the Galapagos, which didn't happen. No. It was independently co-discovered by these two rather sort of middle-brow, middle-of-the-road British thinkers. This is a reconstruction. I love this actually. It's a Soviet artist who wanted to enshrine the great moment. It is a great moment in the history of science. It's the 18th of June, 1858. Charles Darwin is in his office at home. He's a bit of a recluse. He's still not published his ideas. He's still sort of beavering away quietly, anxiously, trying to accumulate so much data, so much information that nobody could knock him out of the park, so to speak. And he gets this letter on the 18th of June from a nobody, man 14 years his junior, who is, if Darwin is up here in the scientific firmament, he's up here, he's a big guy. Wallace is still sort of somewhere embedded in the carpet, right? I mean, he's nobody, he's a collector, professional collector. Doesn't get lower than that in the scientific pecking order in this era. He's in somewhere interesting, killing organisms, sending them back home to make some money. That's his living, okay? Darwin gets this letter from this nobody, in which the nobody outlines the ideas that Darwin has been thinking about rather carefully, rather rigorously for the past 20-odd years. Came back from the voyage of the Beagle in 1836. And this is a cataclysmic moment in the life of Charles Darwin, right? I mean, I suspect there are many here who are scientists. Why do we do science? We don't do it for the money. So I'm trying to think, why do we do it? But anyway, well, one of the reasons is we're there for the ideas, and to a certain extent, we wouldn't admit it, but for the kudos we gain from those ideas. Yeah, this is my idea. I've added something to our understanding of the natural world. I've contributed. But as you well know, in science there ain't no silver medals. If you've discovered something, that's it. You're the discoverer. There might be 432 other people beavering away on exactly the same problem. Nearly there. Oh, damn. It's been published. I'm out the picture. That was what poor old Darwin is looking at in the face when he gets this letter, which was basically a letter saying, look, here's my idea, what do you think? And should I publish it? And Darwin's a decent guy, he knows it. But Darwin could have done an interesting thing, because this letter comes from the middle of nowhere, it comes from the Moluccan Islands in what today we call Indonesia. And that's a sort of 4 or 5 month sea voyage, right? And it's not like he licked a stamp, stuck it on the envelope, dear Mr. Darwin, and off it goes direct. No, it probably went on 23 different ships and 8 different trains and various donkey carts, this letter, to get from the Moluccan Islands to Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin might have been tempted when he gets this letter from Mr. Nobody, who's nowhere, right, to be reading his mail, warming serious trousers with the log fire and downhouse in southern England. Oh, God damn. Oh, no! Oh! And I didn't get to read it. Oh, silly me. And then Mr. Wallace will show up 4 years later and say, did you get my letter? I said, oh, you sent me a letter? Postal service is such crap these days. No, Darwin was determined to do the right thing. So he's having this crisis. He's going to lose his claim to fame, his precedence, his baby, his theory that he's been gestating for this long period of time. And this nobody, who he feels morally compelled to elevate, will garner all the fame, kudos, cash associated with this success. Didn't turn out that way. You know the story probably. I'm going to tell it again later in this talk. What I want to dwell on instead is this. This is what it's known, where I come from, is the London bus syndrome. And I'm sure that's equally true in Massachusetts, I'd say. It's raining, it's London. Okay, I'm waiting for a bus. They come every 15 minutes. Good. The bus shelter has been vandalised. It's London. Okay, so I'm actually getting soaked to the skin. 15 minutes elapse. 20 minutes elapse. I'm now formally hypothermic, right? And then finally, I see the bus stuck in traffic up the Fulham High Street. It's sort of crawling towards me. And you know what's right behind it? Tailgating it? Another bus! Right? So this is the syndrome. You wait and wait and wait, and then not one but two arrive. That's what we've got here. We've got wait, and then bang, bang, to appear. That tells us something really interesting. Not about bus schedules, but about science. What this tells us is maybe it's not Darwin who was smart, maybe it's not Wallace who was smart, but there was something about where they were, about the milieu in which they operated, which made what had previously been a rather inaccessible set of ideas suddenly accessible. So that's the coincidence, is not they happened to, have similar experiences or whatever. No, they were basically in the same place at the same time. And it was the place and the time and the currents, the intellectual, social, cultural, technical currents in that place, all those places, that brought what had been high-hanging, inaccessible fruit, can't reach it, have brought it down to make it accessible, available. So in other words, when we're talking about the history of science, or at least specifically about the history of evolutionary thinking, perhaps we shouldn't get all fetishistic about Darwin and the Galapagos. Perhaps we shouldn't get all wound out of shape about the fact that Wallace has been forgotten, because they're footnotes. If Darwin had gone down on the Beagle, died of his seasickness, which he thought he was going to do on many occasions. If Darwin had died on the Beagle, and Wallace, as I'm about to tell you, had a number of rather serious brushes with death, if he hadn't made it through those, this idea would still be out there. This idea had arrived, and I mean in a sort of ethereal sense. It was in the ether. And I want to illustrate that with this quotation from a man called Herbert Spencer. You've probably heard of him. He's a sort of polymath, slightly problematic, but anyway, a polymath scientist, philosopher, personal friend of both Darwin and Wallace. And he wrote this. I love this statement. This is great. I mean, we're talking about the movie with the creationists and their dogged embrace of 4004 BC. He's addressing the same people, okay? And I wish, eloquently. Those who cavalierly reject the theory of evolution as not adequately supported by facts seem quite to forget that their own theory is supported by no facts at all. Like the majority of men who are born to a given belief, they demand the most rigorous proof of any adverse belief, but assume that theirs needs none. Hey, it's brilliant. I mean, that's a right? Now, it's true when he says theory of evolution, he's not actually talking in terms of the specifics of natural selection. In other words, exactly what we consider to be today's theory of evolution. But let's do this. I told you the theory was unveiled in the academic literature in 1858. That provoked Charles Darwin to get to work as fast as he possibly could, partly to stake his precedence on this idea. So it was July 1858 the paper came out, November 24, 1859, so less than 18 months ahead, The Origin of Species appears, okay? So those are our two sort of red letter dates, 1858, 1859. We've got Herbert Spencer maundering on about the uselessness of what he didn't call creationists, but we call creationists. When? What year? Cold call. Oh, come on! Now, look, the way I've set it up, obviously you're supposed to say, well, it's probably after 1859, Dr. Berry, so it would be maybe 1863. But the way I've set it up, obviously that's the wrong answer. No, 1852. So, and that's kind of my point. This, and as I say, this isn't exactly the theory we're talking about, but it is the theory of evolution in the sense of entities transforming into more advanced versions of themselves, a sort of ramping up of complexity through time, which is what Spencer believed. And now applied, by the way, to society. You go from sort of simple to complex. You go from MIT at that end of Cambridge, you come up here to Harvard. Same with the solar system, with the universe, from simple formless forms to ever more organized matter. And same with life. Life started off as very simple, gelatinous, and eventually, through a number of integradations, became us. Now, as I say, it's not formally modern theory of evolution, but it's just as heretical in the fact that we've ripped control out of the divine's hands, among other things. So that's the point. This idea is out there. There's a sort of upswelling of evolutionaryism in the mid-Victorian Britain. And as I say, you take Darwin and Wallace out of the picture, this idea would have come to the fore pretty soon. We don't know exactly how long in that counterfactual. But, so what, actually the main content of this talk, and knowing as I do various undergraduates who I teach, I know that you can generally handle the first 20 minutes. So if you put everything that's important near the beginning, then we just add filler at the end. So all I have to say that's important comes in this segment, and then the rest of the stuff is fun filler. So what made the 1850s so amenable to this kind of thinking? What was it that brought this doesn't really work, does it? This high-hanging fruit to what made it low-hanging? And I'm going to give you some strands, one of which might offend in this gathering. God. Theology. Now, obviously, one of the reasons that this idea was high-hanging for a long time was that if you made any venture to say something anti the divine, I'm talking Western Europe, the Pope, etc., if you came up with some heretical idea, like God didn't do it, it took longer than 7 days, actually, that sort of thing, you would be burned at the stake or whatever. That has a very retarding effect on the progress in science. So I'm not denying that religion has on occasion interfered with scientific progress. This is an instance, rather interestingly, where religion is key to scientific progress. So, at the turn of the 18th, 19th century, in Britain in particular, there was a theological movement. It's a theological movement. It's not a scientific movement. It's a theological movement, natural theology, which argued, quite interestingly, that there are two ways to know your God. You can read about God in their works, whether it's the Quran or the Bible or the Vedas or whatever you want to read. There's revealed information in the work, in the word. There's also the works. Because God did all this stuff outside. God made all these organisms. God designed these things. So if you really want to understand God, go and reverse engineer a honeybee. Go and study the extraordinary structure of an orchid and figure out what's going on here. If you really want to understand God. So actually it's kind of cool. So this is an invitation to go do science. Now, we're not doing science for the reasons that maybe most of us do science, namely to become famous and earn some money. No, we're doing it for the greater glorification of God and to find out more about God. But regardless, it's an important and powerful factor in this first half of the 19th century in Britain. The most famous state sort of arguer of this was this man William Paley. I'm sure you've heard of him. A brilliant guy, actually. And at this, again, you will know the story that he tells in the opening page, the first page of his great work, which is I'm walking across a heath and I strike my foot against a stone. Pick up that stone, stone, yeah, stone. It's just been there, it's a stone. It's a stone, people. Keep going. Cheek. And this time it's a watch. And we're not talking some crappy third-rate Seiko here. But in that era, a watch meant one of those beautiful fob watches with lots of, cogs and escapement mechanisms. You could see the whole like doing its thing. And Paley said, look, hello, this is not there by chance. This isn't just sort of fallen out of the sky. This has been exquisitely put together for a particular purpose by a watchmaker to tell the time. Therefore, by extension, if I now go and look at a baby rabbit, which is infinitely more complicated than any watch ever will be, how was that put together? There's nothing random about that assembly. God, right? It's actually kind of cool argument. Darwin loved it. And Darwin considered himself a natural theologian, well, for the entirety of the Voyage of the Beagle. So that's one. Weirdly, religion is proving a sort of driver of an empirical scientific process. Two, Britain at this stage was arguably the first flourishing, if we can use the F word in this context, of laissez-faire capitalism. So, Adam Smith, obviously a bit earlier, but what is Smith writing? Smith hews to unfettered competition. And the idea is, even though the competition is ugly and bloody and messy and ostensibly inefficient, the outcome is better products, if you like. Samsung and Apple are duking it out, but we're ultimately the winners because we get a better cell phone at the end of the day. That's the argument. Now, whether or not that's true is obviously open to question, but there's no getting away from the fact that this is early industrial Britain. We've got a whole new class of technocrats and entrepreneurs and business people coming into being replacing the old feudal agrarian landed gentry who were there by virtue of being born into that dynasty. No, this is about a meritocracy. This is about striving. This is about having a good idea and being competitive, right? Now let's think about that, being competitive. So you zoom in, it looks ugly, but competition over time enhances your product. That's natural selection, people, okay? If you think about a herd of zebras being pursued by lions, and they're competing with each other for the privilege of not being eaten, right? I mean, as they always say, if a bear's running after you and there's one other, it doesn't matter how fast a bear can run, it just matters that you can run faster than the person you're with, right? It's that argument. It's competition. As they zoom in, and it's ugly and messy, just as if you zoom into Apple and Samsung engaging in industrial espionage to steal each other's ideas, right? But now pull out and let the whole process play out over a few generations. Now what have you got? You've got faster zebras, right? Just as you have better cell phones. Same damn thing. So that's important. Next one, Malthus. Now you all know about Malthus. Malthus made the very simple but important observation that populations, he's thinking human population, have a capacity for exponential expansion. Okay, obviously, fairly straightforward. Which means, he says, that they're going to ultimately outstrip their ability to feed themselves or house themselves, or whatever he's concerned about, an impending social disaster. And this again, you might say, well, that was late 1798, I think he first published his essay on population. What about the 1830s, 1840s? Became very topical, because now, Industrial Revolution, we brought everyone in from the villages and parked them in these miserable slums in the cities of Birmingham and Wolverhampton and elsewhere, where many of the traditional sort of family resources and support systems of the old agricultural order no longer exist. So what are we going to do with all these people? Especially with the people who might get injured in the ghastly, ununionized mills. What do we do with them? Well, should we have poorhouses? Should we have workhouses? Should we have some sort of embryonic welfare state to look after them? So this is and it's still with us today, let's face it, this debate. But it was a very active debate at the time, and it's put in these terms, these Malthusian terms. Darwin and Wallace both read Malthus and immediately looked away from people, boring, to other organisms. Other organisms, yeah, they too have the potential for exponential increase. But on average, you don't actually go to the seashore and see an infinite number of seagulls. You see a finite number, and most populations are sustained at a fairly stable level over time. What does that imply? That implies an awful lot of mortality, doesn't it? So something is reining in that exponentiality, and yes, it's death. And that death is mediated by competition quite often, right? Because there's only a finite amount of food. You've got 500 seagulls and only 300 food for 300. You're going to have competition, so it's more of the, we're back at natural selection again. Again, we're a hop, skip, and a jump away from natural selection. I've already mentioned a couple of times this, the Industrial Revolution. Again, Britain is at the forefront of creating an industrialized society, for better or for worse. But this has changed the way you think about labor. Because in the old days, if I wanted to transport a weirdly shaped object like this across the room, I would get my donkey, put it on, and the donkey would do its thing. Now, the donkey's a living organism. It's sort of, there's something mysterious and magical about donkeys, I suppose. Now I don't need that, right? I just get my little steam train, put this on it. So I've just replaced the donkey with a steam train, and by extension, I'm thinking the donkey is just a really complicated steam train. It's just a sort of really messy, living, or whatever that is, machine. Okay? We've taken, if you like, the mystique out of living systems. And perhaps the ultimate statement of that comes right at this time, 1818, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Okay? Here we're actually cobbling together a whole new person from a bit of engineering, old leftover spare parts and so on, and a big zap of electricity. Nice idea, okay? Lightning strike. But again, we're moving away as a society from the idea that there's something that when you're born, the divine zaps, again, maybe the wrong image, some kind of life force into it. No, you, humans, everything, we're just complicated machines and might therefore be subject to the same kind of rules that apply to machines. Now, this probably won't warm anyone's hearts. This is a bit the wrong era, but the red bits on the map are the bit crushed under the jackboot of the British Empire. So why, am I just getting sentimental as a middle-aged white male or something? No. We might legitimately ask the question, why was it two English people, Wallace and Darwin, and we've already got Spencer, we'll say a third, who were the smart ones having these ideas. So I might legitimately, obviously, say, because English people are cleverer than other people. I think I'd be wrong. No, the reason is simple. Courtesy a historical roll of the dice, Britain happened in that era to run the maritime empire de jour. Okay? Now, why does that matter? This is more or less, the Darwin-Wallace generation is the first generation that global travel has been possible. So the elite would maybe shuttle between between North America and Europe back in the day. Rich British gentlemen would go on what they call the Grand Tour, which was around the northern Mediterranean in Europe. People hadn't seen the world. Remember, the Cook voyage, which sort of brought back things from Australia to Europe for the first time, wasn't until the 1770s, right? Now, let's think about this. Why does that matter? Let's say I'm a naturalist interested in what we now call evolution. In other words, exploring and discovering the causes of biological diversification. And I live in Britain, and let's say I specialize on butterflies, okay? Britain boasts 65 species of butterflies. And I think 5 or 6 of those don't really count. They get blown over on wet days from Denmark or something, okay? It's pathetic, okay? I mean, there's nothing there, okay? Whereas I can go to the Ecuadorian Amazon and stand here, and literally over my head are 300 different species of butterflies flying around. So if you aspire to understand biological diversity, you have to encounter biological diversity. And the way to do that during most of the 19th century was to be British, because you had this particular privilege of protected global travel that other people didn't have. Okay? So, very much so in Darwin's case, that was an official British government-enabled voyage to go figure out the routes around Tierra del Fuego, the voyages of Beagle. What does this global exploration mean? It means that for the first time in history, we're creating a database of global biology. Not just some regional, yes, the crappy little 65 butterflies in the UK, or the rather more in France, or whatever, or even in North America. This is global. And this is all in the past few decades. Just imagine the first kangaroo, which is just ridiculous. I mean, with all due respect to any Australians here present, these things that stand taller than me, that bounce across the landscape. I mean, nobody could make it up. So these natural history collections, they were basically enormous spreadsheets, effectively. And for the first time, you could actually get a handle on biological. This is what's bringing that high-hanging fruit down. These are once-in-history events that we're being able to make these global connections. So, look, that's the actual content of my talk. that it's these multiple strands, natural theology, laissez-faire capitalism, exponential growth, therefore competition, empire means opportunity to travel, museum collections, and also the Industrial Revolution. So these are all sort of, this is my attempt to teach this. The idea is that all this was sort of sucked into the personae of Darwin and Wallace. So now they should expand, shouldn't they? Oh, they do. Good, okay. Anyway, but that's what science is about. Yes, it's about smart people having smart ideas, but it's so much more about being part of something which might have nothing to do with science, which is germane to what you end up being interested in. Now, I'm going to be a complete hypocrite. I've just said, let's ignore Darwin and Wallace, because it's not about Darwin and Wallace, it's about the milieu, it's about the background, it's about the society in which they found themselves. But, oh no, today's Darwin's birthday. This year is Wallace's 200th birthday, so I'm just going to ignore that and do some sort of standard biographical stuff, because we need to celebrate these guys. And I'm going to do this fairly swiftly, never fear. Born with this little Charles Darwin. I'm talking about silver spoon. I mean, look, really collar and everything. Dad was this wealthy provincial doctor. And it's a usual great man story, actually. Great men always have to, I didn't start off well. I really made it myself because I didn't have any real advantage. You had all sorts of bloody advantages in life. But I do like this. This is Charles remembers his dad despairing of him when he was in high school. You care for nothing but shooting dogs. This is where punctuation is really important. And rank catching. And you'll be a disgrace to yourself and all your family. It is, bad egg growing up. So when I'm teaching this to undergraduates, I have to translate. So what is this? Sort of endless gaming, TikTok, and masturbation. I don't know what. He, as I say, silver spoon. He went to the local private high school. It's called Shrewsbury School. Why do I mention this? Because it's the reason I stand before you. I went to Shrewsbury School as well, and so I took science in the Darwin buildings and everything else. You might think this is fantastic for Shrewsbury School. Just imagine being the director of development. You can't get a better alum. Scientific, revolutionary, and nice guy, right? Unfortunately, wrote in his autobiography, I quote, "Nothing could have been worse for the development of my mind than this school." Nothing could have been worse. Decapitation. Anyway, so he goes to medical school, drops out. As a full-on failure so far. Goes to Cambridge. Actually, it's rather nice. We know from the college records what rooms he lived in Christ's College, Cambridge. So he's on track to become a vicar in the Church of England here. And one of the cool things I get to do is take a group of my students from here over to the UK in the summer on a study abroad program where we explore the history of science that is associated with Darwin and Wallace. So this isn't open to the public, it's an active academic run, so we have to get special permission and everything. And I just like the idea, I've got my 20-year-olds in that very space that Darwin himself was at 20-year-old. And no doubt there's the occasional leftover molecule of oxygen still lurking. Anyway, they're all bored to bloody tears. As you probably know, what he really did at Cambridge was he became connected with a group of scientists and others who were seriously interested in natural history, specifically in Darwin's case, beetle collecting. You've got to love this. This is an illustration by a friend of his. So this is Charles Darwin to Cambridge one night. He's heading out of town to collect some beetles aboard a beetle. I just think that's a great illustration. But it was that connection that put him from beetle to beagle. And then 5 years of extraordinary travel, almost all of which was down here. So the main purpose of the voyage of the Beagle was to survey this water. Why? Because if you wanted to go from anywhere over here to anywhere over here, you went via here. There's no Panama Canal at this stage. And this, as you know, is not the best piece of water. But anyway, let's forget about that. We all know it's the Galapagos where it all happened. But the first thing, it's only 5 weeks. The entire 5-year voyage, 5 weeks only in the Galapagos. Pretty sort of fleeting. And remember, I'd already told you this. Darwin is a good, believing Christian. God found a piece of environment, said, this is the organisms that are suited to that environment. I'll put them there, okay? So that explains the match between the organisms and the environment. You get to the Galapagos, some of you have been there. And there's that volcanic heap of cinders. There's another volcanic heap of cinders. They're all sort of stretched out across the equator. Darwin's thinking, God is not going to go to the trouble saying, I'm going to make some slightly different ones here and some slightly different ones here because it's all the same. So he commits the cardinal sin of scientific collecting. He fails to label properly where his specimens came from. Galapagos. So not only was there, too many people think there was a eureka moment in the Galapagos, and that, the beagle is ploughing through the surf. He leaps out, he's now wading through the surf, gets to the beach, there are those finches bobbing around with different bills, and now we go slow-mo. Eureka! Right, that's it, bullshit. No, he caught a bunch of them and said, I don't even care which island they came from. If you want a eureka moment, it was 6 months after he got back from the voyage. He'd sent his birds to the London bird expert, Mr. Gould. Mr. Gould sits Darwin down and says, you've completely misinterpreted these birds, you idiot. What they are, now he didn't use the term closely related because that's what we'll call a post-Darwinian term. Closely allied group of birds which are unique. These are all new species unique to the Galapagos Islands. This, Mr. Darwin, younger Mr. Darwin, is really interesting. That's when the penny starts dropping for Darwin. And I think that's really telling. I think it's actually beautiful. Because that's how science works. It's not about eureka geniuses, usually. There's the occasional moment. It's about different people bringing different things to the table, and those things complementing each other. It's what we call collaboration. So, it was that collaboration. Gould would never have got to the Galapagos. He needed Darwin. Darwin didn't know the first thing about ornithology. He needed Gould. It was that complementarity that made things work. That's how science works, through connection and collaboration. But as you know, this caused him to start producing sexy notes in his journal. My greatest moment as a teacher was I had a student who inked that, got a tattoo under their shoulder. That kid got an A. He gets married, and he's the whole time he's sort of, he calls it mental rioting, because it's heretical. Okay? He's thinking about these things, and he's actually by 1844 he's got a long manuscript that he's sort of ready to go with. What happens in 1844 though, and it's not quite cause and effect, but it's definitely associated, because this book was published. It's called Vestiges of Natural History of Creation. It was published anonymously. We now know it was published by this man, Robert Chambers. It was a bestseller, and it was a book about evolution. In the sort of sense that I described earlier, the sort of sense of Herbert Spencer, the fact that things change and progress. This book was a bestseller. Abe Lincoln read it. The young Queen Victoria had it read to her at bedtime by her German husband. That is a true desire to learn as a Lincoln. So it sort of brought the idea of, or some notion of change, some heretical idea of transmutation out of the gutter and into the drawing room, so to speak. But it's scientifically very unrespectable. So it was trashed by scientific reviewers. They hated it. And it's not a scientific book. It's not a good piece of science. Including this guy, Sedgwick, who was Darwin's hero and mentor. This is a person who worked most closely with Darwin when he was an undergraduate. Adam Sedgwick, who hated it. And even worse, in a letter to the other famous geologist of the era, Charles Lyell, he writes, I cannot but think this work, because everyone's wondering who wrote this. This work is from a woman's pen. So well dressed and so graceful in its externals. Ooh, God, the sex. Oh my God. Anyway, what does that result in? Darwin pulls back from the brink. This, all my heroes have just panned this guy. If I'm going to go out, if I'm going to put out my theory, boy, does it have to be watertight. But he knows he's onto something big. So I really like this. He writes to his wife and says, look, I've got this manuscript. If I suddenly cock, could you make sure, 400 quid, that's a lot of money, 400 pounds, could you make sure it's published? But in the interim, he's going to consolidate, and then he goes off and spends, I won't say a loony, but it's a rather major investment, 8 years of his life studying barnacles. This was to establish himself as an expert on something, and if you want to become an expert on something, you might as well go with barnacles. And so finally, this is now, we're nearly 20 years on from the return of the Voyage of the Beagle. Finally, he's going to start rather reluctantly putting pen to paper, finally going to get it out. But, as he writes, my plans were overthrown. Overthrown by Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, this is important. I've said he's 200 this year, so we are having a big event, a Wallace party, on Saturday, 22nd of April. It'll be right here on campus at the Natural History Museum. So we're working with a mixologist to create a Wallace cocktail. I think it's the most exciting thing about all that. Wallace was born, Wallace is perfectly middle class, but his father is hopeless with money. So this is actually a perfectly nice house that he was born in. But he had to leave school at the age of 13, didn't have any money, so he's basically self-educated. Became a surveyor. The railways were being put at the time, so there was a lot of money to be mapping out the countryside. And this is actually kind of cool. This is one of his maps. So here's the young Alfred Russel Wallace. He's 14 years younger than Darwin, so he's a generation later. And he sort of develops, as he's doing his mapping, walking through the countryside in Britain, an interest in natural history, the flowers, the butterflies, and so on. But he's completely uninformed, completely uneducated. Until he meets this guy who's actually 2 years younger than him. So he meets, Wallace is 21, he meets Henry Walter Bates, who's 19. Bates has already got a fairly sophisticated interest in beetles. So they become beetle nerds. And, you know,
Oh, did you get one of these? Yes, I've got several of those. Oh, yes, I've got more than you did.
that sort of thing. You know, everyone knows that. Everyone needs a beetle nerd in their life. But, and this is the cool thing, their beetling extends beyond just beetles. And they read this same book. And in fact, Wallace dates his becoming an evolutionist from the moment that he read this book that was so excoriated by the scientific hypes. This is an ingenious hypothesis strongly supported by some striking facts and analogies. I like this. So he wants to go off, he and Bates want to go off and become scientists. But this isn't the 21st century where you go, okay, got to apply to grad school, right? I mean, that structure does not exist. So what they're going to do, and it's because it's all they can do, is become collectors. So there's a big market, museums, wealthy individuals. Hey, we've had dinner. Do you want to come back to my smoking room? Oh, yes, yes. I've got a very nice specimen of a bird of paradise. Love it, old chap. They spoke to each other like that. So that's what they're going to do is this is going to allow them to travel to interesting places, allow them to make enough money to fund their travels, but most importantly, allow them to look around and actually think scientific ideas. Where to go? Well, they don't know anyone. They say this isn't Darwin who's got all these connections. They read a book which has the worst description I've ever read of a tropical rainforest. Monkeys are frolicking through festooned bowers or chasing in revelry over wooden arches. Squirrels scamper in ecstasy from limb to limb, unable to contain themselves for joyousness. Sorry, the notion of sort of exploding joyous squirrels. Anyway, so off they go to the Amazon, obviously. And this is actually a print, fantastic print from Bates's book. And they're looking for high-profile, big-money specimens. So this is a cock of the rock, just a loony thing. I mean, everyone wants one of those on the breakfast table, right? Or this is an umbrella bird with this crazy plume. It was a huge success. They collected amazing stuff. They split up, actually, in the name of efficiency of collecting. Wallace went north on the Rio Negro, and Bates stuck on the Solomales, collecting amazing new stuff. But at significant hardship. They're sort of backpackers, right? It's not like Darwin on the Beagle. Beagle arrives in town and the local hacienda owner sends a horse and four to pick up Mr. Darwin and so on. He's in a dugout canoe with a pile of specimens paddling upstream. Nearly dies several times. His brother comes out to work for him and does die. I mean, this is pretty brutal collecting, but eventually, after 4 years, it's time to go home. And so he's going to come down right across the continent, and he's going to pick up so he's got all these pickled, dried specimens, but he's going to also bring home a menagerie of some 30 animals, living out spider monkeys, the ones with really long arms. A toucan. Now, this is pre-David Attenborough, right? Just imagine walking into a London scientific salon with that baby on your arm. Mr. Wallace, who's a nobody, will no longer be a nobody. Right? July 1852, he boards the brig Helen, headed for the UK. All the stuff goes aboard, all those animals. This is a freighter. He's the only passenger. 3 weeks into the voyage, he's sharing the captain's cabin. There's a knock on the door of the cabin in the morning. It's the captain. Mr. Wallace, he says. Mr. Wallace actually records these words. I think you should know the ship is on fire. So it turns out, retrospectively, that probably there was poorly stowed cargo, which on the rocking ship, the friction, so it created a smouldering fire in the hold. First big mistake was, we better check it out. Rip off the hatch covers, you just oxygenate the fire. And this is a wooden ship that's been sitting around the tropics for a while. It's basically a tinderbox. So they have to instantly abandon ship. It's a perfectly nice day though. So the plan is this. There's this enormous pyre in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. They're going to stay in the ship's boat circling it and hope that somebody is brought in by the flames. Okay? So Wallace, for the next 24 hours, watches the drama unfold. I think it's one of the most poignant moments in all of history of science, and there have been a few. So for a start, everything is, going up in flames. Those pickled specimens, many of his specimens were actually pickled in cachaça, in local cane rum. So there are the explosions as his specimens get heated up. But then the living animals. And remember, he's brought them across the continent. These aren't just his passport to the big time. These are his pets. He's nurtured them. He's cultivated them across the continent. He watches as one by one they're sprung from their cages by the flames, and they go out to the last part of the boat that is not on fire, the bowsprit. But the bowsprit is only temporarily spared, and he watches as each one is incinerated. Were they rescued? Not for a while. 10 days in an open boat. I think I'm right in saying that if they couldn't, they were out of water basically, so another day and they would have been toast since they had to use it. So just in case your imagination is struggling here, this is the ship Helen. We're in the geographical centre of the Atlantic now. That's one. Wallace, almost as soon as he's rescued, started writing a letter to a friend and colleague, and amazingly that letter has survived, we still have it. It's a colleague on the upper reaches of the River Amazon. So the address is Senor Ricardo Spruce, Amazonas. So back to London, made it to Spruce, who's a botanist in the field, and Spruce hung on to that, and it's now stuck in the museum. It's amazing, actually. What did he write? Well, after, I think it was night 3, during the night I saw several mutuals. And in fact, could not be in a better position for observing them than lying on my back in a small boat in the middle of the ocean. Just putting a positive spin on things. Now, I don't know about you, but if that had just happened, your dreams of becoming a scientist have just literally gone up in smoke. I would come back here and say, all right, management consultancy it is. Not Wallace. Within 18 months, he's on another ship, this time to Singapore, and he now spends 8 years doing the same damn thing, essentially, in Southeast Asia. This is his own map. All these lines are his journeys, extraordinary journeys throughout. Largely modern Indonesia and into New Guinea and Peninsular Malaysia. Same deal, collecting specimens for money, including birds of paradise, but still thinking. And in 1855, he has his first, what we'll call a theoretical paper. He wrote it during a rainy season in a hut at the base of this mountain on the north coast of Borneo in Sarawak. And this is a quotation. It's actually a super insightful statement. Every species has come into existence both in space and time with a pre-existing closely allied species. Let's unpack that. Space. If I find a kangaroo in Australia, where do I go look for other kangaroos or things which are sort of similar? Wallabies, let's say. Do I go to Cambridge, Massachusetts? No. Do I go to Istanbul? No. Australia, right? Why? Because there's a genealogical process. You've got an ancestor spinning off descendants. So you get these geographical clusters of related taxa. Same in time. If I find in this stratum a particular Protoceratops dinosaur, where do I look for related dinosaurs? Do I go much deeper in time or much more recent? No, I look in contiguous strata. Why? Same deal, ancestor-descendant genealogical process. This is half of the theory of evolution. It's what Darwin called descendant modification. Okay? It's only half. Wallace was very disappointed by the reception of this paper. He thought, this is pretty in-your-face heresy, man. Sends it off to a journal, it's published, and he's waiting, bring it on. I can handle it. Nothing happens. It's a normal story when you publish a ball-busting paper in Science, everyone ignores it. Except Mr. Darwin, who'd actually written initially asking for some specimens from this collector guy. They have a minor correspondence. Darwin says, yeah, I'm sympathetic. Nobody's interested in these big ideas. Which is why the next time Wallace had a big idea, he sent it directly to Mr. Darwin, because he didn't want this one to fall catatonically silent like the previous big idea. He has malaria, probably. He's in fits of shivers and of heats and chills. He's in the Moluccan Islands, and he glimpses what today we call natural selection. And this is the luckiest thing that ever happened to Charles Darwin, because instead of sending his manuscript off to a journal, which he'd done with every other idea he'd ever had, he wants this to get some prominence, and because of the lack of prominence on the previous paper, he sends it to his one connection in the upper echelons of science, Charles Darwin. So, which is why here's the Victorian postman knocking on the door of Down House. And here is, do go to Down House if ever you're in the UK. It's a wonderful, fully restored. And this is, in fact, the chair that Darwin sat in to write The Origin of Species. Unfortunately, they've got a rope and an infrared beam, which I have crossed so many times. They basically sent a security guard. Anyway, we've already been there, 18th of June. So what happened was these guys, who apparently, according to the Soviet artist, happened to be, so they treat Darwin opening his mail as a sort of spectator sport. Okay, Joseph, let's go around and watch Darwin open his mail. That's sort of what we get here. These guys are high-ups in science. They organise for this weird joint but not joint presentation at the Linnaean Society, which is London's principal biological academic society. Just 2 weeks later, 1st of July. Wallace hasn't been consulted. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had sent some good idea I'd had to some august professor, and the next thing I heard was, it's now published in the name of August Professor and Obscure Mr. Berry, I might be a little irked. But so there are definitely issues about whether this was the right thing to do. But these guys, Lyell and Hooker, thought it was the right way to protect Darwin's precedents and still at least include Mr. Wallace. So this is the Linnaean Society. These are my students looking a bit perkier, aren't they? So it's actually, if you've been to the Linnaean Society, weirdly, the talk was given not in what is today the Linnaean Society, it was given in what is today the British Academy, the art gallery. So there is a nice plaque there. And there it is, theory is published. Now, as I say, I might be a bit irked if I were Wallace. I sent off this idea to Mr. Darwin and suddenly it's sort of been railroaded. I love this. This is a letter to his mother. So he gets the news about what has happened. Dear Mummy, you're not going to believe this. The key thing is, look, this assures me the acquaintance and assistance of these eminent men on my return. In other words, he's gone from an in-the-carpet nobody to being a scientist, to being a force to be reckoned with. And that's what he aspired to. So whether he was shafted a little bit by Darwin and his cronies is of no consequence to him. Same applies when, so what I've already said, Darwin rushed out the origin of species. And this is Darwin planting a flag saying, my theory, did I mention it? It's my theory. I think Wallace is mentioned twice in the origin of species, 500-page book. Okay. Does Wallace say, excuse me, hello? Could we perhaps go first person plural occasionally rather than sticking to the first person singular? No. Wallace, ever generous. Mr. Darwin has given the world a new science in his name. Should, in my opinion, stand that above that. But every philosopher, ancient or modern time, the force of admiration can no further go. Now, I'm running hopelessly late. I have another 5 or 10 minutes. I can let people who had had enough leave. I'll be personally offended. So yeah, let's just, I'll try and scurry through the rest of the story, because it's a great story. Wallace comes back in 1862. He's now famous, he's made it. And he and Darwin become fast friends. It's actually a really nice part of the story, the way they connected, if you like. And the best thing about it is there are these huge disagreements, one of which will really resonate well with this crowd. And it's this. Wallace hated the term natural selection. As you probably know, that term comes from Darwin's first chapter of The Origin, where he's talking about artificial selection. The fact that we can take a wolf and turn it into dogs, Pekingese, Great Danes, God knows what else. We're all comfortable with that. We know how it works. It's the breeder who has carefully taken the biggest dog and the smallest dog and so on. And so if you're comfortable with that, then by analogy, natural selection is just that sort of thing without the breeder. Wallace hated it. Because the whole point of artificial selection is there's a breeder, there's a selector, somebody doing the selecting. If you're going to assume it's an analogous process and call it natural selection, that implies the same thing. There's a selector, an agent. God, right? So it's actually kind of cute. He's gone through, this is Wallace's copy of The Origin of Species. I don't have a high-res scan of this, I'm afraid. You can see his marks, his marginalia. It's the same damn one. He's crossed out natural selection, but survival of the fittest in each place. And Darwin, to give him his due, said, yes, I think you're right. I agree. but it's too late. It's already called natural selection. There's no bringing that baby back. Second thing, sexual selection. Darwin, as you know, published in 1871 his book, Descent of Man, on sexual selection. Sexual selection, among other things, explains sexual dimorphism. So here's a male, female, superb fairy wrens in Australia. That's sort of ridiculous. Why are they so different? And I won't rehearse Darwin's ideas, but it's about him looking sexy to be attractive to females. So there's selection on one sex and one sex alone to look sexy, and that's why you see this so-called dimorphism. Wallace had a perfectly good pushback on that. He said, excuse me, the reason she looks like this is, and it's not obviously a different species, but the female is the one who's typically sitting on the nest with the eggs. So if I'm bright blue, day glow, neon, hello predator, eat me, right? So he claimed it was natural selection in favour of crypsis. Now it doesn't explain the crazy colours of the male, right? He's claiming that's the sort of default, and that's been taken down, ratcheted down by natural selection for the female. So it's an incomplete, but I mean, there's some truth to what Wallace is saying. But the big disagreement, and this is one where he's going to lose his audience here, unfortunately, is Wallace decided that natural selection alone was not enough to account for this thing, the human brain. That's the only exception he was willing to grant. But it's a rather important one, I think you'll agree. And this was for two reasons. One, he became a spiritualist. You know, go to a seance with a medium, sit in a circle, hold hands, and the medium says, "That is your aunt." And that's not me kicking the table. That's your aunt who died 5 years ago, telling you that, I don't know, buy another pound of bananas. It was a scam. But lots of people were in on it. So this is a photograph supplied to Darwin by his own cousin, Hindley Wedgwood, who was a big fan of spiritualism. Look! A spiritual lap dance. Again, look, this is just because you and I look at that and say, oh, well, hello, just multiple exposure, but we didn't have that kind of sophistication in those days. So he's a spiritualist, and in his defense, this is a society where everyone goes to church. He's disavowed church. Lacuna. What do? So there were a lot of progressive thinkers who really liked spiritualism because it seemed more empirical, didn't have all the mumbo jumbo of established religion. But much more interestingly, Wallace's disavowal of natural selection in human evolution stems from his relationship with non-white people. So this is Ali, who was his assistant throughout his travels in Southeast Asia, and they showed each other their lives on several occasions, and there was clearly a strong bond. Unlike Darwin, remember, privileged visit, here's the hacienda, here's your guard, and so on. He's dependent upon local people to see him right. So much so, now, so here's a nice statement. The more I see of uncivilized people, the better I think of human nature on the whole and the essential differences between civilized. Remember, this is Victorian time, when the Victorian males in particular deem themselves superior, biologically superior to others. The essential differences between civilized and savage man seem to disappear. And this is because he's sharing a hut in New Guinea with some craftsmen. And he recognizes that that craftsman is every bit as smart as he is, right? So, this is interesting. He goes to the next step. He then decides that the New Guinea native has too good a brain. It's an over-engineered brain. Why? And this is where so far we've been quite enlightened. Now he's going to become a product of his time, because this person's got this great brain, but they've never done any pure math. They've never read any Horace. They don't even know who Shakespeare is. So in other words, their brain is useless. He's completely overlooking the fact that that guy knows the medicinal use of 450 different plant species in that rainforest and can carve extraordinary geometrical patterns into the prow of his war canoe. Okay? But for Wallace, the quote savage brain is too good, it's redundant. And he knows, and this is correct, that natural selection can't produce things other than things which are strictly useful. So natural selection can't say, well, I'll give you a really good brain because it might be useful down the road. No, it doesn't work that way. And he's right there. But anyway, the combination of these two things meant that he took humans out of the picture on natural selection. Darwin, this was 1859 when he came out of the closet and says, I hope you've not murdered too completely your own and my child. Final thing. as I've already said, this is about how science should be done. And I've said it's collaborative, but it's also highly critical. You read the correspondence between these two about the three topics and other things they disagree on. It's fantastic. They're going for it, man. No, you're wrong. Your example here is flawed. No, but I've got this. My friend here told me. It's real bang, 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 down and out. But very respectful. And have the wife and kids, right, at the end. It's really nice to read. And I love this. 1871. That book contains, it's 2 volumes initially. It's Human Evolution and Sexual Selection. In other words, 2 of the big 3 that they disagreed upon. And Darwin writes rather apologetically, fate is ordained that almost every point on which we differ should be crowded into this single volume. Wallace writes back, I love this. I look forward with fear and trembling to being crushed under a mandate of fate. Bring it on, man. That's how it should be. That's how science should be done. Very finally, because it is Darwin-Wallace Day, this is a metric of the obscurity of Wallace. This is Wikipedia page hits. This is from several years ago, doesn't matter. Pale blue is Darwin, green is Wallace. It's about a 10-fold difference. 2 points of interest. One is people are only interested in Darwin and Wallace during the week, presumably when homework is silent. And 2, I like this, there's Darwin's birthday. Whoa! So apparently there's a significant subset of humanity, when they see news that somebody's birthday, say, what, how shall we celebrate it? Let's look them up on Wikipedia. So, and there are all sorts of reasons, and it's a whole separate lecture as to what happened and why Wallace has been largely forgotten, not entirely forgotten. And part of it is definitely this problem. By coupling his wagon, so to speak, with Darwin, he's destined always to be Robin to Darwin's Batman, or Dr. Watson to Darwin's Sherlock Holmes. And nobody cares about Dr. Watson or Robin, right? But Wallace was partly responsible. Even before the term Darwinism gained currency, he wrote to Darwin in 1868 saying we should call the theory Darwinianism. Fortunately, it didn't catch on. Wallace came here to Cambridge, Massachusetts to give the Lowell lectures in, I think, 1887. Went to the Natural History Museum. Darwin's dead. Louis Agassiz's dead. Louis Agassiz constructed this museum as a rebuff of Darwinian thinking. Okay? Wallace loved it. He says, inadvertently, Mr. Agassiz has created the best possible exhibit to explain Darwin's theories. But one of the things he was doing in the US was lecturing. And people came up to him afterwards and said, look, that was so clear, so beautiful. I've read The Origin, didn't quite get it, but you've clarified things up. So Wallace, always in need of some money, said, okay, I'll turn this into a book. So this is, and he's published 20 odd books. I mean, but this is his big book on evolution. And it is, we actually know he was planning on writing a book when he was in Southeast Asia, but when Darwin told him that he was now working on The Origin of Species, he nixed that project. So this has been a long time in coming. Finally gets his book out. It's an important book, it's a great book, it's still a heavily cited book. What does he call it? Darwin. Thank you very much. And I do apologize for going on so long, but you know, it's Darwin's birthday. What else would grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was actually he was a medical man, but a rather brilliant sort of polymath thinking. He was so his best friend was Josiah Wedgwood. They knew the man called Strata Smith. Strata Smith was the guy who established geological sciences, and he was an engineer. So he was exposed to exactly what you've described, and not just barnacles, but obviously you've got whole slates of fossils that shouldn't be there. But then you recognize you've got that, say mussel beds here, and then you go 50 miles over there, and it's a completely different height of hill and everything else. And you find the same mussel beds. So that was, and Smith created the first geological map. on the basis of these correspondences in fossils. And I always think that Charles has been a little underhand in dismissing the influence of his own grandfather as a leading evolutionary theorizer of his day. So he was definitely, you're right, picking up the baton of his grandfather, and yes,
Hey, feeling any better?
obviously, the fossil record is massively biased in favour of either things like you, who've got hard endoskeletons, or things like barnacles or mollusks that have hard exoskeletons. So barnacles are a big part of the story. Two other components, though. One was he encountered some interesting barnacles on the voyage of Beagle. So I think so he got the sort of personal flavour. They're such weird things. So, it was only shortly, I don't know my barnacle history well enough, but everyone had assumed for a long time they were mollusks, because they look like mollusks, right? They stick on rocks, they sort of are boring, and that's what like mollusks. But no, it turns out they're, as you know, crustacea, they're little crabs lying on their backs with these sort of fake molluscan shells around them, wiggling their legs in the air. So there was the novelty of that idea, the Beagle encounter, and then finally, he was very coy about who to talk to, because he didn't want leaks, basically. And so he chose Hooker, who's a botanist, as his insight. It's interesting choices. Hooker was a kind of groupie. He was younger, and he was a fanboy. And that was kind of what Darwin wanted. He wanted somebody who was smart, informed, but knew his place. Botanists, especially in that era, what you did to establish yourself as a serious botanist was you did a taxonomic revision. You took a particular, let's take the Magnoliaceae, and I'm going to try and collect all known species of them and figure out how they're connected. That was how you sort of impressed the world that you were serious. So that was Hooker's advice to. So remember, we've had the slap down of the Vestiges book. Darwin is anxious about, he's got to impress the scientific cognoscenti with his idea. He unveils his idea to Hooker, famously writing, he wrote a letter, it's outlining his idea. It's like confessing to a murder. It's kind of telling you where he's coming from. And it was Hooker's advice. He says, look, what we do in botany, we establish our credibility by diving in headfirst into a particular group and then you become a world expert. Right, because you've chosen a group that nobody else is interested in. So you're completely right, but the barnacle choice is actually super interesting because there are all sorts of factors. So, people have written books about this. Often they'll play the sort of class card. But to be honest, he was poor, but not. He was still bourgeois. I can give you 25 other instances of his insistence that he's a Johnny-come-lately and that Darwin is. Part of it is because it's just recognising that Darwin did get there first. The documentary record is such and so on. So I think he would just say he's telling it as it is. And he would say the fact that he happened to be a co-author on the key publication in 1858 was serendipity. It was because Darwin had delayed and then he sent his letter. So he had no ownership in it whatsoever. And I think in some way, this is maybe relevant, he liked to think of himself as a bit of an outsider. And he was, because he wasn't in the sort of older men club with Darwin. And I think it probably was in his own interest, therefore, not to identify too strongly with the in-crowd. So he had all sorts of disputes with Huxley and Darwin over spiritualism. for example. So, by explicitly divorcing himself from Darwin, he's allowed to be the free thinker that he wanted to be. That's poor pop psychology, but that's the best I can provide. The other thing is, of course, he got what he wanted. So, what he wanted, and he spent 12 years roaming these distant places in order to make it as a scientist, and by hitching his wagon to Darwin's, he finally made it. So I think beyond that, but it gave him what he needed, namely the leg up. So now he's got an audience, people who publish his books, read his papers, and so on. So he doesn't need to spend his whole time saying, well, actually, I co-discovered it with Darwin. So, but no, it is ultimately partly a personality trait. My favourite example is the Malay Archipelago, which is this beautiful book that he wrote about his journeys, is in some ways monstrously detailed. So there's a nice contemporary review. It seems that Mr. Wallace has transcribed every single notebook page as he took his notes on this great journey or whatever it is. It is stunningly detailed. And yet he doesn't mention the discovery of evolution by natural selection. So it's in other places we get the account of him having this malarial effect. In the book about this journey, and this was the key finding that came out of the journey, he does not mention it. So however you paint that psychologically, I think almost pathologically, it seems over the top somehow. But really interesting.
And I'm from Singapore, and so when you mentioned that you had gone there, I was like, oh, that's interesting.
So Singapore was kind of his, I won't say his base because he was all over the place, but he sort of inevitably went in and out quite a lot. And there's a guy called John Van Vine at the University of NUS who does a fair bit on Wallace and has curated an exhibit at the Natural History Museum, which I've not seen, but which is apparently very good. So next time you're
Thank you. Great talk.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. Oh, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Enjoy the talk.
Logic.